Hello, my name is Chris Henriksen. I am the editor of Approaching Justice, which can be found at approachingjustice.net. And at approachingjustice.net, we will have a variety of links, as well as other amazing content related to the topic of discussion for today. And that topic would be moral relativism, a term that got bounced around a lot in the last week, or week and a half, I guess, related to an Ensign article which invoked the term. One of the reasons why I find this term fascinating is that I often find people who disagree with the use of the term in certain contexts. In this case, the Ensign article are quick to defend moral relativism. I think we have to be careful because in some ways religious or traditional defenders of certain moral views are quick to use moral relativism to define everything that they don't like. In this case, oftentimes things like gay marriage or homosexuality. However, there are plenty of good reasons to reject moral relativism, and those reasons can be secular as much as they are religious. And today I want to look a little bit at that because I think whether we are religious or not, we should reject relativism, even if we at the same time disagree with how some people would couch the concept itself. To look at relativism in some senses is the idea that there are no morals. And in two ways I would use, we can look at that term. The first of which is in cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is an idea that's rooted in many ways in anthropology, which says that if you look at cultures across the world, or even within the United States, or someplace like the United States, that most cultures have different rules. The 19th century sociologist, anthropologist, philosopher William Graham Sumner called them folkways, essentially saying that each society has their rules, and those rules, preferences, traditions are often the basis of what we call right or wrong. Now, for Sumner, this basically proved or showed that there were no universal moral rules. And I think that that's a jump that we don't necessarily have to take. Because indeed, many different cultures have different rules about dress. And we can see this even within Mormonism. Views against smoking, views against facial hair. These are things that are changing all the time. But they don't necessarily apply universally as moral wrongs. They are cultural preferences. And we see this oftentimes in terms of cultural outlooks, in terms of dress, attire, and so forth. And we can recognize that some things are not moral, but are instead related to tradition, or related to cultural preferences, trends, norms, those types of things. So not everything that we call moral is about morality at all. It's essentially things we don't like. And we have to be mindful of that. But that does not mean that they're not moral, right? Or that there is not morality in general. In some ways, I think cultural relativism is an important thing to recognize, so that when we are making moral evaluations, we need to be able to say, wait a minute, to what extent are the things that I'm saying are immoral? Am I just saying, I don't like those, or I'm uncomfortable with them? And we'll come back to that in a second. Now, in addition to cultural relativism, we have ethical relativism. And ethical relativism is an idea that basically dismisses the idea of morality at all. It says that there is no morality. We set up moral systems, and that they are a matter of power and control. And there is no sort of universal morality beyond that power and control. Now, I can see why we might view that. In many ways, the moral rules of those in power are more likely to be enforced by law, more likely to have the greatest amount of impact culturally. At the same time, I think that that gives us an opportunity to sort of distinguish between what is moral and what is simply the views of the majority or the views of those with the most amount of power. One way of doing that, I think, is to look at theoretical views of morality. And I want to use two my favorites. which not only, I think, establish what universal moral laws are, but they also give us a way of distinguishing between what are mere preferences and what are issues of morality. And one of those is Immanuel Kant. Kant is a thinker who we often call deontological. And by that we mean his focus is on actions. Which actions should we as moral people do, and which actions are immoral? And for Kant, he used a number of different ways of trying to approach this, and I want to sort of simplify it a little bit for today. One of those is through his basic categorical imperative. And that categorical imperative says, would a particular action be one that you would will for everybody to follow as a universal moral law? And in this case, the universal moral laws were essentially saying, would the principle, not just the action itself, but would the principle based upon this action be something that we would want to universalize? And so for him, the reason why we shouldn't kill people, even if we might have some personal, social reason to do so, is because we wouldn't will people to kill others whenever it was convenient, or whenever we had a really good reason to do it. In general, we don't want people to do that, so those are the rules that we should follow. Now, for Kant, he applies this to some things like lying. And he sticks to it, because we often want to sort of say, well, what about lying? Lying's generally bad, but there might be good reasons for it. And Kant is quite a stickler on this, in that he says, no, it is immoral. You shouldn't do it, no matter what. And this is something that makes Kant look rather a stickler, or maybe somebody who is impractical. But at the same time, I think he's also recognizing that sometimes we're really quick to give ourselves an out. And I will come back to that actually in a future episode of this video. The other sort of view that I like to use is utilitarianism. And utilitarianism and Kant are often viewed as sort of in conflict with each other, but maybe not so much in practical application. Utilitarians focus on human well-being, both with pleasure and pain. What's going to cause people to be happy, what's going to cause humans to have suffering. And they also introduce, and Kant does this as well, a certain idea of impartiality. And so it's not what makes me happy, but what makes the most amount of people happy. And so in many ways, what is the moral thing to do might not be what makes me happy, because it would bring about a large amount of suffering to others. Now, the reason why I mention these is because both of them give us ideas of what moral laws might look like. And I think in some ideas, certain things like rape, murder, lying, stealing, theft, all of these type things can be viewed as things that are wrong, things that we should not do. And we can come to those conclusions without the Ten Commandments, though the Ten Commandments gives us some of those rules. At the same time, how do we define issues like homosexuality? How do we define things like sexual morality? I think we can disagree on those things, but there might also be some universals. And let's take rape, which was the context of some of the disagreement, or at least some of the criticisms of the use of a recent talk at BYU Idaho, where they said, are we sort of promoting rape culture? And for me, I think that rape is an example of something that we can say is a universal moral wrong. It might be something that is more accepted in certain cultures, but I don't necessarily think because it is accepted in some cultures, we can say that it is right in those cultures to allow for or for people to rape others. Rape is wrong. And this is a universal moral absolute. And we might sort of say, well, maybe there are cases. Well, with Kant, I would say on something like rape, no, I can't think of any. And in those cases, we can then sort of see, well, something like rape is wrong. It is a moral wrong. And what about other things? What about things like homosexuality? Is homosexuality wrong in that same way? Some people would say that it is. I want to say that it's something that is a little bit more culturally constrained, culturally contingent, in that in some cultures it is viewed as that it is, some it is viewed that it isn't. And I think this is where utilitarianism comes into play, right? Does homosexuality cause harm? And we might sort of argue, well, maybe it's something bad. People who are gay shouldn't be gay, it's not good for them, that type of thing. Utilitarianism would reject that, in that we can't necessarily go around telling people what's good for them and what's bad for them particularly if they're not causing harm to other people. And I think the more we get to know people who are gay, the more that we have gay neighbors, people who are openly gay around us, we start to notice that they are not as harmful to us as the boogeyman theories tend to make them out to be. And in fact, they are often really good friends and neighbors. Now, for Kant, I think he's going to take these things a little bit differently, where he really is wanting to make absolute these principles. If we can't make them an absolute moral principle, it's hard to do that. And one of the guides he gives us is sort of an idea of human dignity. Are we using people as means to an end, or are we respecting their intrinsic humanity? And I think this is what ultimately comes into play with issues like gay rights and gay marriage. Are we using gays as a political football, or are we respecting them for their basic humanity? And in some ways, for me, that has been the largest issue. Can we treat somebody like they are an outsider, even if they are our fellow citizens? And so that concept of the categorical imperative has probably had the greatest influence on me directly when it comes to how do we view homosexuality as a moral issue. Now, it's easy, I think, sometimes to say, well, there is no morality. But we are often making moral terms, and I think we can agree with each other on things like rape is bad, that rape is something that we want to do away with, and we want to do away with it not just in our own communities, our own country, but around the world, and make people safe from such atrocities. And that we don't necessarily have to agree with sort of a colonial worldview that says we need to go around and stop everybody from doing that, but that most people in their communities are going to be able to agree that that's something we don't want to have. So my point today is basically saying we need to be critical of moral claims that a lot of people make. However, this does not mean that we are going to accept or acquiesce to the idea of relativism, because there are still moral rules. Are these moral rules decided by the powerful? Well, in general, one of the problems we have is that even rules like rape, that we can agree are universal, are often not accepted by those who are in power, or at least not the people in power are not fully committed to them. And that is the thing that we're trying to change, is to change some of those attitudes so that our moral sensibilities can match up with our legal framework and the legal frameworks around the world. Up next, in my next segment, I will address a question that has come up a fair amount of time about an early Book of Mormon story about that it's often sort of questioned as a matter of relativism or consequentialism, and that is the first Nephi character Nephi and the beheading of Laban. And we will take a look at that from a moral perspective, particularly as to whether or not it is something that we would defend from a utilitarian view. Thanks, and for now, please check out approachingjustice.net. And join us again for another one of our video shorts. Today's video has been supported by Oldie from Books, and I appreciate them. You can find them at oldiefrombooks.com, and we will see you again soon.